The NBA Finals begin this evening. It's going to be a very interesting finals and one that we haven't seen arguably before, but certainly some pieces we haven't seen in quite some time. And we know the Bucks, we think the Bucks have a new coach. We know he won't be the highest paid coach in the league. That reserve falls to another Central Division coach. I'm Justin Garcia. She's Camille Davis. We'll get into it on Locked On Bucks.
You are Locked On Bucks, your daily Milwaukee Bucks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And welcome to Locked On Bucks. As I mentioned, I'm Justin Garcia. She's Camille. We're filling in for Kane and Frank today. And Camille, I mentioned at the top as we record this, I know they adjusted the tip time. So we're about 2 hours away from the NBA Finals, Game 1 beginning. And I've been asked about this a couple of times on a show earlier today, actually, too. But how much, I guess we'll start with the two teams. What do you think the public perception is going to be of this finals?
That's the question. We have all of the ratings watchers coming out saying it's going to be an extremely low rated finals, and it might be. But as a Bucks fan, one thing I can relate to is this predicament here, because when we made it to the finals in 2021, Milwaukee and Phoenix, there was a lot of talk around, well, who's going to really watch this NBA Finals? And even people who weren't Bucks fans came in with it was an exciting NBA Finals because, the Bucks went down that 0-2 hole, came back in some exciting fashion. So I think if you're somebody who likes basketball, just in general, it's worth tuning into. My mom is a very casual basketball fan. She gives out, I think, some of the best nicknames to NBA players because she just doesn't know. When she first saw Trae Young, she called him Baby DeBarge because he's like a DeBarge family member. She just recently saw Nikola Jokic for the first time and calls him Rocky IV because she thinks he looks like
Ivan Drago
from Rocky. So even she called and she was like, I think I'm cheering for Rocky IV tonight. So she's tuning into the NBA Finals and she's a very casual basketball fan. So it might not be one of the highest rated, finals. It might not even get better ratings than what the Lakers and Golden State got in the second round of the playoffs. But I think for basketball fans, it should still be an entertaining finals.
And that's kind of where I'm at as somebody that likes basketball. I think the matchup is pretty good. And obviously Celtics, I think it's tough to argue we're not the more talented team, but we've seen enough of the sample size to know they're not a trustworthy team. And I trust, as much as I despise them, I trust this Miami tonight. The other thing that we mentioned at the top of the show before we get more into the Bucks is Monty Williams has landed a new job. Now, he's going to be the head coach of the Detroit Pistons. And I don't know about you, but as this coaching carousel played out and we saw the Bucks reportedly choose their coach, we saw Nick Nurse move on, all of these names started to be picked off and teams finding their coach. There was the Detroit Pistons as that lone team remaining. Now it's the Raptors. But I assumed all of these coaches moving on and the Pistons not getting the number one pick, I kind of assumed that meant it was going to be Charles Lee that was going to Detroit. I did not see this coming.
Me either. And the early reports said that, they even offered Monty Williams a contract and he was like, no, thank you. I don't want it. I think I'm going to take the year off. He's getting his check from Phoenix because they still owe him some money as well. I believe it's like 20 or 21 million over the next 3 years or something like that. So I could see why he was like, you know what, I'm taking the year off. But Detroit came and offered a really, really big bag, one that's really hard to turn down. And honestly, I think Detroit's a really good fit for Monty Williams. He was a name that was thrown out even in the Bucks coaching search. And I felt for the Bucks, he wasn't the right fit. Watching him, it's like, I know what he's good at. He's not a bad coach by any means. I don't think that any of the coaches that were let go in this cycle are necessarily bad coaches. But I do think that certain coaches fit certain situations better than they do in other ones. So when you look at Milwaukee and Monty's possible fit here, it just didn't seem like a good fit for me. We know he's a player's guy. We know that he's good at development, but we haven't seen him be able to take that veteran team to the next level yet, even in Phoenix. And we saw he also had some problems with Ayton there. So it's kind of like what was happening with that. I just didn't see too many differences between Monty and Bud. But when you send somebody like Monty Williams to Detroit, where you can set the culture, where you have a young roster, where you're able to build up, we saw him do that in Phoenix. He took over a very bad Phoenix Suns team and turned them into a contender. So I think with Detroit and with that roster that they do have, although they didn't get a top 3 draft pick in this upcoming draft, they still have a lot of young talent on their squad already, and they're going to have a top 5 draft pick this year as well. So I think it's a perfect fit there. Someone who can set the culture. Seems like he's going to have free reign to do a lot of what he wants to do with that franchise there. So I think it's a good fit for him. And looking at another Central Division foe, it's kind of like, well, they're going to have a good coach there for some time that the Bucks are going to have to deal with over the next few years.
Yeah, it's I agree. I think it's a really good fit. When I first saw the news, you saw the numbers and you thought, man, is that me? Or that's a reporting come out of this is the richest coaching contract in NBA history, and thought, okay, that checks out. But I agree. I think it's a really good coach, a really good hire for the Pistons because of that young talent. Because of another thing that you touched on as well, in that with I think we can say the exception of Jay Crowder and DeAndre Ayton, players love playing for Monty Williams. He has a lot of these guys throughout the league. Kevin Durant loves Monty Williams. He worked with him obviously in Oklahoma City. That wasn't the reason, but it was one of the reasons why the Phoenix Suns were the only team on his list of where to be dealt to. So he has that connection with players. And if you're a team like the Pistons, at this point, you have to develop that talent. And Monty Williams may not be the guy to take you across the finish line, but he can start to build those foundations and make you a perennial playoff team and develop that young talent. And again, his connection with players, I mean, that is going to be helpful in recruiting, especially as we start to navigate into this new CBA and all the unknowns that are coming with that. But you mentioned the coaches in the division. So you got Monty Williams in there now, who's a very good coach. Rick Carlisle is in the Central Division. And really the Pistons and the Pacers are the two teams that I think most Bucks fans can relate to, at least these current iterations of the team, where it's not that long ago that the Bucks were the Pistons and the Bucks were the Pacers, where especially that Pacers comparison, where you have a guy like Tyrese Halliburton who's just starting to come into his own and a couple of nice pieces around him, but you're just hopeful to get into the playoffs and go from there. With the, up until not just Bud arriving, but Giannis really starting to ascend, that was the Bucks for basically 2 decades.
Yeah. Exactly that, which again is where I'm like, that's really good for Detroit. And even when you look at the Pacers, I mean, this season they played better than what I thought that they would coming into the season. They had some injuries down the stretch. And then, of course, they were trying to improve their draft stock a little bit towards the end of the season. So that all factors into it. But when you look at the Central Division, like it's going to be interesting in a few years if these young teams develop the way that I think they can, because looking at Detroit, another team where I wonder how this season would have gone for them if Cade Cunningham never got hurt. That's another big piece for them there as well, because he's right now the engine that drives that team. We got to see Jaden Ivey develop a little bit more without Cade being there. They have a plethora of centers in Detroit right now, so Monty will be able to figure out which one fits his playing style better. But it's similar to when Bud came on for Milwaukee, in the sense of like, sometimes you need a coach that's going to set the culture for you, who's going to set what's expected to make it a professional environment so that these young guys can grow. The Bucks had more, older talent on their team when Bud came here, but he was also somebody who set a culture coming off of the Jason Kidd years where, based on reports, it was not necessarily the healthiest locker room here. So I think that's a good hire for Detroit. And I see why they threw the bag at him, because you only get one chance at, a hire like this. And I do feel bad for Charles Lee, because from everything that I did read, if Monty Williams did not take that job, Detroit's job probably would have gone to him. And I think that would have been a good landing spot for him as well, because again, when you're getting a younger team, you have a little bit more grace, a little bit more time to develop and grow with the team as well. So that's bad news for Charles Lee. And I hope that his time comes soon. But for Detroit, I think Monty Williams was an exceptional hire.
Yeah, I think it's a great hire. And, mentioning Charles Lee, it is interesting now in what is potentially next for Charles Lee. I want to get to that and what's next for the rest of this staff, especially once the Bucks do make it official with Adrian Griffin taking over as the head coach. But I do want to make a fast break to FanDuel here during the NBA playoffs, because right now, new customers can get a no-sweat first bet up to $2,500 That's $2,500, $2,500 back in bonus bets if your first bet doesn't win. Great promotions running daily. It's safe and things together. FanDuel, the #1 sports betting app out there. And again, new customers, your no sweat first bet up to $2,500 back if your first bet doesn't win. No better place to bet all the action than America's #1 sports book. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and get a no sweat first bet up to $2,500. It's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of the NBA. And Camille, we mentioned Charles Lee. So it is interesting to see not just Charles Lee, but head coach Mike Budenholzer, former head coach Mike Budenholzer. His name has popped up in a few of these openings, but we've seen them start to settle here. Nick Nurse lands in Philadelphia, as we've discussed in the past. The Raptors, I believe, are the only opening right now. And I know Bud's name did come up very briefly there, but it seems like Toronto, based off everything coming out of their reporting, is still not really sure what direction they're going to go in. Fred VanVleet is going to be a free agent. He's had some kind words for both Adrian Griffin and Nick Nurse on their way out. So obviously people are going to wonder about his future. And I think whatever, it may be as simple as whatever Fred VanVleet decides to do may give the Raptors their answer for where do they go? Do they try to retool on the fly? Do they try to rebuild here? Is that something that reportedly Masai Ujiri was in favor of doing, but was kind of outvoted within the franchise? So for those reasons, I have a hard time seeing Bud end up in Toronto. That it's to me at least looking more and more like this is just going to be a year where maybe we get TV Mike Budenholzer.
It's interesting that you say that too, because when you're looking at the openings, like Toronto just doesn't feel like the cleanest spot for Mike Budenholzer at this point in his career. I don't think I can see Mike Budenholzer being a TV personality. He doesn't strike me as somebody.
Well, I'll say this. The Bud that you see on the sidelines is very different from the Bud that you see away from that. But other than that, yeah, I'm with you that it's still a tough sell of, okay, turn on the personality.
Yeah, because the only other opening that would kind of make sense for Bud is in Phoenix. And I don't recall seeing his name being too closely attached to that particular job there as well. So I could also see it being a year for Bud where he just like, I'm just going to take a year off and see what happens. Because if there's one thing we know about the NBA at this point, the coaching carousel continues to move on and there's always going to be openings coming up. So it could be good for him as well, because we don't know all of his personal stories, but given what he was going through during the playoffs and just aspiring, like it might be a good time just to kind of reset, have some time with the family. He's still going to get a couple of checks from the Bucks along the way as well. So, being able to make a few millions while being at home with family doesn't also sound bad either. And it's a chance to recharge, kind of reflect on how things went, coaching philosophies, think about what you might change going forward. So I feel like we haven't seen the last of Bud on the sidelines. I just don't know if it's going to happen this season for him.
Yeah, definitely a chance to recharge for Bud, especially you mentioned everything he was going through in the postseason. That I'm sure a great deal of him is kind of looking for that to just take a step away and put things on pause. The other thing I would bring up and wonder, is this something that we're going to see more of going forward? Is, if Bud just chooses to say, I'm taking this year off, but something opens up during the season, and what Quinn Snyder did with the Hawks, right, if that kind of becomes the new norm, where if you're one of those elite coaches, rather than waiting on the offseason cycle, just say, I'm going to take some time and I'm going to wait to see if there's a team that maybe disappoints and another club is looking to get in front of this, and I can get into a team that fits me a lot better and is more ready-made to win.
What would be interesting? You saying made me think about it. Like we talked about, I think it was last offseason when Quinn Snyder got fired, and it was like, wouldn't it be interesting if he popped up on Bud's staff and just kind of was able to, sit on the bench for a while before he gets his next head coaching gig? Don't really know what's going on in San Antonio, but we know Bud has connections there. It could be something interesting as well to kind of keep an eye on. This is, again, me completely speculating, but just being a fan of Bud, it could be really cool to see him end up back in San Antonio at some point without, especially not knowing what Pop's future is going to be, how long he's going to be coaching. Like, he has Wemby coming, so Pop might say, I got a few more years to be here and coach this phenomenon. So who knows? But again, I don't think we've seen the last of Bud. And maybe he does the Kenny Atkinson route where he goes to a bench, be a lead assistant for someone somewhere, and then build from there. But again, I think Bud has a lot more coaching ahead of him.
Yeah, and Frank Vogel's another guy that we saw after leading the Lakers to a title and getting fired, took this past year off. His name has surfaced with a handful of teams, but he's still out there and he's in a similar spot. And that brings me to this next question of, again, the Bucks have not made it official yet, but the reports are that Adrian Griffin is going to be the head coach. I've seen some people saying, well, should we be concerned that this news broke on Saturday and we're still waiting for the official word from the team as we're now almost a week later? I'm not too clear on I know you basically have to embargo all of those hires and information during the finals. I'm not clear on if you would have officially made this announcement on Monday or Tuesday. Could you have held the press conference? But that certainly is playing a role, and I would assume the Sixers are going through the same thing as well with Nick Nurse. But with Adrian Griffin, we spent so much time talking about what are you going to look for in a new coach for this team, and a team that feels as though their window is still open to win a title. And the whole balance of, do you go with one of those proven names or do you look for something new? And I've talked about it before. I know Eric Name has talked about it as well. Of ordinarily, I'm more in favor of hiring the newer guy because with everybody else, you've kind of seen it before and you know what you're getting. So maybe I can get something unique from Adrian Griffin in this example. But I think it is going to be very important, as we saw what took place in Boston, how he filled big names out there that have a lot of experience and have some head coaching experience as well. I'm not saying you have to get somebody as your lead assistant who has been a head coach, but you have to get somebody, I would think, that has a lot of experience at this level.
Absolutely. And when you look at the Boston situation in particular, like that was thrown together right before
last minute,
like very last minute. They lost some coaches along the way as well throughout the season, didn't replace them.
Now, oh, by the way, everybody else is leaving.
And it wasn't like these were guys that Joe Mazzulla picked for himself. Like, this is going to be my bench. So he just kind of had to deal with something haphazard and roll with it. And they were able to get to the Eastern Conference Finals. But again, a very talented Celtics team makes sense. Another perspective looking at it with the Bucks, like, we also have a pretty talented team, at least at the core here. We still don't know what's going on with Chris or with Brooke, but when you have Giannis, one of the best players in the world, it drives a lot of your offense, a lot of your production as is. So I think it is going to be important for him to stock his bench properly. And it seems to me as if he's the kind of guy who knows that as well, based on the reports I've seen, which is the interesting thing about hiring a new guy, because prior to the hire, it's not as much information out. But then once that hire happens, you're seeing all these articles come out, giving you a better idea of what he's like. And I'm looking forward to seeing what he brings to the team, because I mentioned last time I was on here with Kane about the finalists that we had, that for Adrian Griffin to be a top 3 finalist for this job, especially as a first-time head coach, he had to have been phenomenal in those interviews. So to see him getting hired and knowing that part of it was because Giannis was like, this is the best candidate, I think, out of the 3. Like, that's who I would want. Gives me some confidence in what he's going to be able to do and bring to the team as well, especially given the fact that he's a defensive-minded coach. Curious to see what the offense looks like under him and what he's going to do on that realm with the assistant coaches as well. And also curious to see what he does with MarJon, because he is somebody who's known as a player development kind of guy. He won't have as much time as he did in Chicago with Jimmy Butler because he was assistant then. Roles are different. You have more time to be able to work one-on-one with players. But if he's a guy who has an eye for player development, I'm curious to see what MarJon will be able to do next season, especially when looking at this roster, seeing what the CBA is setting up for going forward for this team with the luxury tax and the 2 different tiers and how you don't want to go over that second tier. MarJon's going to be important if he's not, traded this summer or anything like that. But he's a piece that's going to be important for this team because they're going to need as many bodies as they can. And on top of that, he's one of the youngest bodies that they have.
Yeah, you mentioned the CBA, and we should point out too, there will be the salary cap special, and that show will be tomorrow with Frank Madden. So, any of those questions you have, or most of them, should get answered. So I'm curious to check that out because not to get too much into this new CBA, but to me, that's really the biggest unknown of this offseason, and why somebody you mentioned like Marjan Beauchamp, it's going to be so important to have a guy that has a track record of development to work with him and improve him, because that may be the Bucks' only path. I think we've all kind of jumped to the conclusion of, well, teams like the Bucks and the Clippers and the Warriors, they're screwed because of this new CBA. But I'm curious to see how teams treat this, because that's our assumption. I was talking with somebody earlier today who said, the thing about CBAs is you don't really know how to navigate it until you're a couple of years into it. So we may not see any major changes or teams changing how they do things for another year or two. But to me, it's going to be very telling what you see other teams start to do as free agency begins. And if the Bucks take their cue from them of, do the Warriors say, this is way too crippling, we're going to have to package Jordan Poole and something else for a pick. And our guys our teams trying to shed some money. To me, that's going to of what the Bucks do with Chris Middleton, and especially with Brooke Lopez. But as we mentioned, Frank Madden will have a lot of that discussion for you on tomorrow's show on the salary cap special. Before we do wrap it up, we mentioned assistants and who you would look into. I wasn't sure about the timeline, and I thought these two guys, they may have missed each other like ships passing in the night. And I looked it up as you were talking, and that is in fact the case. But I was wondering, one name we have heard come up that the Bucks interviewed for the head coaching position, what would be the possibility of him joining the staff of Adrian Griffin as one of the top assistant? And that was Scott Brooks. I know Adrian Griffin spent some time in Oklahoma City. It was the year, I believe, after Scott Brooks had been fired, and he was working with Billy Donovan. But still, like, those to me are the types of names that you would look to. And if you're looking for an offensive slant, everybody's going to point to Mike D'Antoni. Truthfully, it does seem like a lot of these coaches that you would look at as veteran guys for a lead assistant role, a lot of them, at least the ones coming to mind initially here, are going to be more on the defensive side. And that's not to say you can't make that higher because of Adrian Griffin's defensive background. But if you were looking for, let's get an offensive genius to be his assistant, outside of Mike D'Antoni, I'm not sure what's out there.
That's a good point. And it might be a situation where, because Adrian Griffin has 15 years of coaching experience in that assistant ranks, he might have an idea of some guys that he's worked with along the way that still might be assistants, where he's like, this guy has it and he's someone to bring on the staff. And the thing with Mike D'Antoni, I think I might have mentioned it on here before. I know we talked about it on Technical Foul before as well, but he seems to do a lot better offensively with teams that have point guards that can really run the show. Yeah. And that's no knock on Drew, but Drew is not a traditional point guard in the sense.
Drew is not Steve Nash.
Right,
Drew is
exactly.
Not James Harden.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's not the exact same. Like, it might be more of like when we saw D'Antoni in New York, where it's like it doesn't seem to be fitting as snugly as we've seen it fit before in the past. So even though we know the offensive genius behind him, knowing his system, I wouldn't be confident that it would pan out in Milwaukee if he was a lead assistant. So maybe Griffin has some guys that he's worked with along the way that he knows has some really interesting ideas that he can bring along to Milwaukee as well.
Well, before we sign off, let me ask you this. What would your initial thought be to Adrian Griffin bringing in Scott Skiles as his lead assistant? The man who really got him started returns home to Milwaukee for the third time that would be?
Maybe third time's a charm. Maybe third time's a charm for Scott Skiles. I wouldn't feel too strongly about it either way. It's kind of like okay, if that's what you want to do here, like that's what we're going to do. But wouldn't get me excited. It also wouldn't make me want to throw my computer out the window or anything like that. So it would kind of be like, that's interesting. Okay, here we go. Who else is on this staff now?
And I saw a few people ask too, what about the possibility of Charles Lee being assistant on Adrian Griffin's staff? I'm not opposed to it. I think the chances are very, very slim, and especially from the Adrian Griffin perspective, that you were basically Charles Lee in Toronto, and now you're coming in as the lead guy. That's always an awkward thing to have that guy still on the new team now.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know how that would go. I know Josh Oppenheimer stayed a few different coaching staffs because of his work. So you never know. Like it's a chance, but Charles Lee also might want a new fresh start as well here. Like if he doesn't get a head coaching gig this summer, he might just kind of be like, you know what, I am going to try to, get in a different way. So we'll see. Again, I really do hope the best for Charles Lee. From everything I've heard about him, he seems like a guy who's going to make a dynamic head coach one day. So I'm hoping to see that day come soon for him.
Yeah. Just hang out and wait for Bud to find his new landing spot,
Right.
and then be ready to join him. We should mention two things. We already mentioned Frank will have the salary cap special tomorrow. So all the questions you have about what can the Bucks do, what about other teams, who's really in the toughest spot here in terms of their cap coming into the summer, Frank will have all those questions answered for you. And speaking of Frank, he also let the cat out of the bag earlier today that you and I, Frank, Kane, and our friend Eric Name will be doing a live version of this show Wednesday, June 28th at
Wednesday, June 28th, 7 p.m., Broken Bat. Looking forward to it. Like, to get all 5 of us together, it's kind of like the Infinity Stones all coming together or something like that if you're a Marvel fan. But no, it should be a really good time. I'm very much looking forward to it. It'll be my first time actually meeting Kane in person as well. Like, we've been the best of friends here over Zooms, over the StreamYard, over the podcast. So it'll be nice. I might even have a beer. I'm not even a beer drinker. I don't drink. But, for this occasion, I think I'm going to crack one open with the crew for sure.
More surprised we're getting Frank in person than we are actually getting Kane over from Australia. But yeah, June 28th, 7 p.m. at Broken Bat. All of us will be there and look forward to meeting up with all of the Locked On Bucks loyal listeners and viewers as well. Frank, speaking of, has the salary cap show tomorrow. For Camille, I'm Justin. We'll talk to you next time. All right.